In April 2025, Alexander John Frank Stubbs secured a definitive legal victory. The Employment and Labor Relations Court ruled that his former employer, Fourth Generation Capital, had unlawfully terminated his contract. To rectify this breach, the court ordered Fourth Generation Capital to pay Stubbs a specific financial award, 2.8 million Kenyan shillings, calculated to cover both compensation and his unpaid pay in lieu of notice. For a terminated employee, an award of this scale is designed to serve a singular purpose. It is a terminal payout meant to make the plaintiff whole, restoring the financial baseline that was illegally stripped away by the firing. Stubbs waited 4 months for compliance. Finally, in August 2025, Fourth Generation executed the wire transfer. This ledger shows what actually arrived in his account. The employer took the 2.8 million shilling judgment, unilaterally deducted over 1 million shillings in statutory levies, and remitted a final total of 2,011,233 shillings. The math created an immediate collision. A definitive judicial order to pay a specific amount does not guarantee that the plaintiff's bank account will reflect that exact number when corporate payroll processes the execution. Stubbs interpreted the missing million shillings as corporate defiance. From his perspective, the employer was using creative accounting to shave down a legally binding decree. In retaliation, Stubbs bypassed the court entirely. Violating an active legal stay order, he deployed auctioneers, physically attached, and seized one of Fourth Generation Capital's motor vehicles to force payment of the missing funds. The physical seizure triggered 3 months of procedural chaos. The court stepped back in, nullified the vehicle attachment, and fielded 3 emergency motions from both legal teams. A mathematical dispute over how a payroll department interprets a court order had escalated into the physical, unlawful seizure of corporate assets. To resolve the chaos, the court had to ignore the seized car and address the legal void that prompted the retaliation in the first place. The entire conflict hinged on a single, specific question: can an employer lawfully deduct statutory tax levies from a court-ordered compensation award for unfair termination? Fourth Generation claimed they were legally obligated to extract 4 specific levies from the judgment: pay-as-you-earn income tax, the Affordable Housing Levy, the National Social Security Fund, and the Social Health Insurance Fund. This dispute forces a direct confrontation between 2 massive authorities. On one side, the finality of an employment court's judicial decree. On the other, the strict, uncompromising mandates of the Kenya Revenue Authority. This maps the conflicting case laws presented to Justice Redito Stephen. The employer built their defense on Egerton University, dictating that all court awards remain strictly subject to standard statutory deductions. Stubbs countered with Ibrahim Menyara v. ASK, asserting that compensation for a terminated contract cannot legally be classified as active employment income. The threshold problem was stark. The court had an established history of issuing contradictory rulings on this exact mathematical scenario. Precedent alone could not resolve the trial. Stubbs advanced a structural argument. He claimed the Employment Act's mandate for deductions only applies to administrative directives by lower-level labor officers. Once a dispute escalates to a formal judgment from the ELRC, that decree supersedes administrative requirements. The employer rebutted this by pointing to the supremacy of Parliament. They argued no court order grants a citizen immunity from national tax legislation. With case law deadlocked, the court abandoned precedent. Justice Redito Stephen was forced to deconstruct the bedrock language of the national statutes themselves. The analysis begins with the law that generated the payout in the first place, the Employment Act of 2007. Section 49, subsection 1 of the Act gives courts the explicit legal authority to award financial remedies, including the 2.8 million shillings. But the legislative caveat appears immediately afterward. This flowchart shows Section 49, subsection 2. The statute dictates that any payment, quote, shall be subject to statutory deductions. This creates an inherent limitation. The Act demands deductions be made, but completely fails to define what specific payouts qualify as taxable income. It merely acts as a signpost, forcing the judge to consult national tax law to determine if severance money meets the criteria for taxation. The court's focus shifted to the second statutory pillar, the Income Tax Act. Section 32A2 outlines the state's broad mechanism for taxation. It allows the government to tax standard gains or profits derived from an individual's active employment. To find out if a court award counts as a profit, we look at the specific text buried within Section 5, subsection 2C of the Income Tax Act. The text explicitly defines gains to include compensation received for the termination of a contract. Under the strict letter of Kenyan tax law, the origin of the money is irrelevant. A post-termination judicial victory is mathematically and legally identical to a standard monthly paycheck. That solved the income tax, but the court then had to evaluate the remaining deductions, the Affordable Housing Levy and the Social Health Insurance Fund. Section 4 of the Affordable Housing Act mandates a 1.5% tax. Crucially, the statute dictates this must be calculated strictly against an employee's gross salary. This exposes a massive legislative blind spot. The Housing Act contains no provision that classifies a post-separation lump sum legal award as gross salary. A similar statutory structure appears in the Social Health Insurance Act. This split screen compares the SHIF Act against the Income Tax Act. Notice the temporal constraint. The SHIF Act specifically targets income generated during employment. The employer was applying active employment levies to money that was awarded specifically because the employment had been unlawfully terminated. Applying these continuous monthly payroll levies to a lump sum severance stretches the statutory text completely past its breaking point. With the statutes deconstructed, Justice Roderick Stephen delivered his final legal determinations, resolving the tension between the competing laws. Returning to the mathematical breakdown of the disputed million-shilling deduction, the court issued its first ruling on pay-as-you-earn. The PAYE deduction receives a green checkmark. It was entirely lawful. The judge reasoned that because Section 52C of the Income Tax Act explicitly taxes termination compensation, Fourth Generation Capital was completely within their legal rights to withhold income tax. An employer acts lawfully and successfully avoids KRA penalties by strictly withholding PAYE from an ELRC termination award. The judge then turned to the secondary statutory withholdings. The focus shifts to the Affordable Housing Levy and SHIF line items. For these deductions, the court ruled them unlawful. The court's logic was purely economic. The Housing Levy and SHIF are continuous deductions. Stubbs had already paid them with each monthly salary during his active tenure at the company. Retroactively applying these ongoing levies to a lump sum post-termination award equates to unlawful double taxation. It penalizes both the employer and the employee for the same active employment period twice. The ruling establishes a hard line. Ongoing statutory payroll levies instantly lose their legal authority the moment an employment contract is legally severed. Stubbs v. Fourth Generation Capital Ltd. establishes a definitive dual legal standard. PAYE on court-ordered severance is non-negotiable, but continuous statutory levies cannot be retroactively applied. For HR professionals and corporate legal counsel, the takeaway is the requirement for extreme precision. Post-judgment payroll cannot be processed using standard monthly payroll software parameters. A court order dictates the top-line number, but the statutes dictate the final transfer. Mismanaging the complex statutory math of a payout is as legally hazardous as losing the trial itself.